In my previous classic World of Warcraft video, I shared with you all why Silverpine Forest is one of the best and most underrated zones in the game. A forest full of lore and world building and even forgotten villains that's dismissed by most of the player base in favor of the Dusty Barrens. And it was in that video I asked you all if you wanted to see me cover the Lord of Shadowfang Keep, who is, most don't realize, one of classic WoW's most powerful lore characters in the story. For some, that statement might come as a surprise, but I think you'll understand what I mean as this video continues with his story. As always, a big thanks to this channel's sponsor, Zygor, which is linked down below in the description if you want to check them out. Use code Nixxiom for 20% off, and let us begin. I want to begin this video first by stating that I'm going to be covering the original classic WoW version of Archmage Arugal and his beloved sons. For those that don't know, he had a very different story when this game came out compared to what you're likely familiar with, because Blizzard did a lot of retcons when it came to this guy. So for a lot of you listening, some of this story might sound familiar, but a lot of it might be entirely new. So let us begin in the country of Gilneas, where a young man whose name is Arugal ventures forth from his homeland, searching for magical knowledge with the mages of the nearby Dalaran. Arugal, who would later become the Lord of Shadowfang Keep, had a very humble beginning. He was a student among the Kirin Tor, and although he likely struggled early on with his academic studies, ultimately he proved himself skilled and knowledgeable enough to be granted the rank of Archmage, much to the displeasure of many, we might assume, but we'll talk about that later. Arugal, having successfully completed his studies, he looked forward to a long career as a mage, and yet his dreams were stolen away by the coming of the Plague of Undeath. What began as simple sickness, something the mages of Dalaran felt they could easily contain, the Plague of Undeath spread like wildfire across the north of Lordaeron, turning those who contracted it into undead in service to a growing host called the Scourge. From the towers of Dalaran, Arugal watched as this undead curse grew greater and spread to the far corners of the land, and yet he did not despair, for Dalaran's magic was great and its walls were high. An outbreak of undead was no threat to the Kirin Tor nor Lordaeron as a country. Or so the Archmage believed, for when the word reached him of the death of King Taranis of Lordaeron at the hands of his beloved son Arthas Menethil, Arugal grew disturbed, and a shadow of doubt breathed into his mouth and gifted his spirit its first taste of doubt, despair, and even panic. Perhaps he began to think, seated in his high chambers, Dalaran's defenses may not be enough to hold back the tide of undeath, for if Lordaeron could fall, couldn't Dalaran too? We don't know if Arugal was present for what happened shortly after, but it's likely that he witnessed what he feared most, the destruction of his beloved city. The scholarly pride of the North Dalaran one day in the twilight of the Welkin suddenly began to rumble and shake, not from an approaching army or act of nature, but from something far more terrifying. A magic unknown to the mages of Azeroth shook the ground at the city's feet, cracked the stone of its high towers, and the city of mages began to collapse in on itself. Roofs fell onto families, schools toppled over into ruin, and the high walls that Arugal once believed unbreachable were shattered without struggle. This magic, it was not of the Scourge, but of something far darker, from a place and tongue unknown to the mages of the Kirin Tor, and perhaps it was then that a new shadow breathed into Arugal's spirit, and he conceived an idea, born out of a desire to safeguard, but one that would quickly be twisted into something far more sinister. So, whether or not Archmage Arugal was present at the destruction of Dalaran at the hands of the Burning Legion, it makes no difference. He knew of its end all the same, and he fled, taking what supplies he could carry and going west, back towards the country from whence he came. Yet he stopped just north of his homeland, and he took shelter amongst the keep of Baron Silverlane, believing it a safe place to begin his studies to unravel the issue of the oncoming Scourge. For it was only a matter of time before the Plague of Undeath reached the south of Silverpine Forest, Gilneas, and beyond. Arugal, perhaps driven by pride or a reckless desire to be a savior, began to try and find a way to stop the advance of the mindless undead. But the mage, he was not alone. He had contact with many surviving mages of Dalaran, and he would communicate with them often of the comings and goings of news and information across the north of the eastern kingdoms. He would ask of progress against the Scourge, of the magic that destroyed Dalaran, if what remained of the Kirin Tor had a plan of action to push back against all these threats. Yet all of his questions led to but guesswork and muted replies. There was nothing concrete, no true plan to stop the advance of the enemy, and Arugal, atop the towers of Baron Silverlane's keep, began to despair all the greater. Like Dalaran, so too would these walls be broken and these towers torn down unless he did something. It would come either by magic or by the gnashing jaws of ghouls. It was only a matter of time. Something had to be done. A solution had to be found. And it was then, at the hour of need most desperate, that Arugal found something that he had not intended to find amongst what remained of his past life. For one day, while going through a number of books recovered from the ruins of Dalaran, he picked one up and read a curious title. This particular tome of knowledge was written by none other than the mage who was known for his powerful elixirs and researching into the creation of enhanced beings. Perhaps Arugal began to wonder, this tome, this one, might contain something that could be used to fight against the Scourge. The Archmage flipped page after page late into the evenings, seeking answers under candlelight, for the mere introduction of this book had stunned him. It was a pondering text that had written, detailing his discovery of something feral on a world afar. And this, my friends, is what Arugal read. The land of Azeroth is host to no end of wonders. Flora, fauna, cultures, and magic all teem across its surface. Indeed, the curious will find limitless variety on this world. One merely has to look. But if one looks deeply enough, then windows to entire new worlds are found. And each world is home to its own wonders, just as each world is home to its own horrors. This is the purpose of my book, to catalog those beings, those otherworldly fiends who would destroy our lands, so that explorers who happen upon them will know what they face. So if you consider yourself a guardian of Azeroth, then read on and know your enemy. Flipping further, Arugal read, "The fiend of which I write is the Worgen. Old rural folklore may hearken to these creatures, for what farmer's child has not heard the tales of beastly wolfmen stalking the fields and marshes outside of his village? And truth may hide in such tales. Perhaps they are warnings against the Worgen, veiled as myths to frighten us. But before such tales are dismissed, let me now assure the reader, Worgen are real. They may not be from our world, but avenues exist between their home and ours, and powerful magic can pull them here. Some chants are best left unuttered, for wherever the Worgen tread, they bring terror and bloodshed with them. You will know the Worgen by its resemblance to the wolves of our world. When viewing a Worgen, one can easily see its coarse hair, pointed ears, and long snout are akin to the wolves we know. But you will just as quickly see its differences. That coarse hair surrounds a powerful, two-legged body, sporting long fangs and dagger-like claws, and behind its howl lurks a malevolence possessed by no natural beast. The Worgen's home is a dark place of nightmare. If that world fosters locations safe from the cursed Worgen, then my research has revealed no such bastions. And if one considers the ferocity and wickedness of the Worgen, it is likely that no such bastions exist. It is surmised that the Worgen are content to remain on their world, for although some Worgen possess powerful magic, they have made no attempt to reach Azeroth of their own accord. And for this, we are fortunate. As mentioned above, some Worgen are skilled in the mystic arts, and their magic is of darkness and corruption. Curses and supernatural poisons are common, so be forewarned. Those who face the Worgen should arm themselves with wards against shadow. It is my hope that no Dalaran wizard seeks out the Worgen, even if done in light of conscience, for no pact may be struck, no secret may be learned, no good can come from these beasts. They are best left to their world, for if found in ours and not destroyed, our peril will be dire." When Arugal read these words, he became enchanted. His mind drifted to distant planets, places that held monsters and magics far greater than anything ever seen on Azeroth before. For you see, everybody, in the original classic WoW storyline, the Worgen were not druids of the pack, nor former night elves, but instead these savage creatures from a distant planet who waged an endless war against the Burning Legion, who were unable to conquer the Worgen and tame their savage nature. Arugal, learning this information, he likely formed a plan almost instantly. Summon these creatures to Azeroth, despite any of Ur's warnings against such meddling, and unleash them upon the Scourge and its masters. Arugal's idea, however, was not received well. His fellow mages, heeding the advice of spoke loudly against the Archmage's plan, stating that such beings as Worgen should be kept as far away from Azeroth and its conflicts as possible. But Arugal, who had grown tired of waiting and doing nothing, would not heed the wisdom of his peers or of his senior mage. In secret, he began to experiment with summoning rings and other occult practices known to few. His studies and experiments consumed him, as well as the creeping shadow that whispered to him still of the inevitability of the world's ending should he fail. But Arugal would not fail. It was perhaps one day, late into the night, while the nearby town of Pywood and the castle slept, that Arugal succeeded. A great howl echoed across the forest, and the mage, delighted in his success, celebrated alone with his creation. The following days, while the mages of the Kirin Tor continued their talks and debates, Arugal unleashed his Worgens upon the northlands of Silverpine. The feral beastmen, relentless and savage, sniffed out the undead haunting the silent woods and began to tear into them. The Scourge, having never encountered such monsters, were unprepared for just how violent and terrible the Worgen truly were. Before long, the bodies of many undead littered the roads, woods, and fields of the land. Arugal had succeeded where his peers had failed. And the Archmage, he was of course eager to share of his success, and he met with the Kirin Tor one day after having secured great victories with his Worgen across the countryside. Now he expected to be welcomed as a hero, to receive praise and reward for having solved the Scourge crisis once and for all, but he was mistaken. His colleagues voiced their concerns, dissatisfaction, and doubt at these newly summoned monsters, as they called them. Monsters. Arugal must have thought to himself, these monsters had just saved them. But his fellow mages would not be turned from their concerns, and Arugal, rather than being hailed, he was condemned and scolded for reckless use of magic against the Kirin Tor's wishes. And perhaps it was then, we might assume, that Arugal's Worgen sensed the growing anger in their master, a shadow in him that was growing all the greater, similar to their own. And so, those wolves of a world afar grew restless, angry, and they rose up like a tide with their master's anger. What followed was something Archmage Arugal likely regretted, but deep down was satisfied by. The Worgen, without hesitation or mercy, tore into the ranks of the mages of the Kirin Tor, slaughtering them and chasing down those who tried to escape. All the while, Arugal stood nearby and watched. He watched as the men who had doubted him were torn to pieces, how those who had wasted months of time were forever silenced between the crushing force of wolves' jaws. And the Archmage said nothing. He said nothing too when the Worgen stormed the keep of Baron Silverlane, who had given Archmage Arugal refuge in the Kirin Tor's time of need. The Baron too, along with his bastard family, according to the Warcraft RPG books at least, they were all torn apart, the Baron's blood decorating nearly every hall of the keep. Even Silverlane's paladin commander, whose name was Springvale, a member of the legendary Silver Hand, he too met his end as well. His soldiers ripped apart despite their armor, despite the light that was meant to protect them. And all the while, Arugal walked in the silence of his shadows, ascending the hill towards the keep. When he entered, all that remained were the silent corpses of the former residents. The Baron, his men, servants, and guests all had found a similar end at the hands of the Worgen. Arugal, upon seeing what had occurred, finally snapped. His ambition, his desire to be a savior, revealed itself as mere pride and vanity. And shame seized him then, shame and guilt. The Archmage fell to his knees, weeping into his robes until his tears mixed with the stone of Silverlane's keep, forever binding the mage to its stone walls. But Arugal was not alone in his grief and shadows. Around him were his Worgen, who still looked to him as their summoner, their master, and the Archmage, with nobody left and no spirit left to give him any joy or comfort, he reached out and proclaimed them his loyal sons. He adopted them, in a manner of speaking, you could say, into what remained of his heart. And these monsters from another world, so terrifying and fierce that even the burning legion could not conquer them, they silenced the wailing of the Archmage, and they gifted to him comfort. Years later, during the events of Classic WoW, Arugal sits atop the towers of what is now called Shadowfang Keep, watching with his loyal sons, safe forevermore in his haunted castle. A few things should be noted, however, following the events of this story. A few rather tragic details that I should mention to you all. The first being Pywood Village, a place I haven't spoken too much of. This village, it was spared annihilation at the hands of the Scourge, was a place of safety amongst the trees of Silverpine Forest. That is until Arugal cursed it. Now why he did this, we're not entirely sure, but one day the Archmage reached out his hand from above in the keep, and he spoke words of power over all those who called the village their home. And when the moon rose that next evening, the citizens of Pywood beheld a terrible fate. For with the rising of the moon came a transformation. The people of Pywood found themselves to be Worgen as well. And perhaps Arugal did this to create more sons for him to adopt, or perhaps he wanted the people below to feel his grief, his loneliness, and his own curse of sorts, trapped forever atop his tower. We may never know what the Master of Wolves intended with this horrible magic, nor if he intended to spread the curse to more lands across Azeroth, Hillsbrad, Alterac, and beyond. What do you all think? Because if he had chosen to do so, would this not have made Arugal one of the most powerful beings on Azeroth, wielding an army of terror wolves from a world afar, capable of rivaling even the power of the Burning Legion? For those of us who knew Arugal's story during Classic WoW, it was a terrifying thought. And perhaps this is why it was so imperative for the Forsaken and the Kirin Tor to have him contained and then killed before his reckless magic could spread further across the world. But there is one last detail to mention, probably the most important one of all. Arugal's story may be one of sorrow and shame and guilt, but there is one last tragic detail to who he is. I sort of mentioned it near the beginning of the video. Before I reveal it though, if you have been enjoying this video, please do me a favor, hit the like button just to help with the algorithm, and if you're moved by this story, consider becoming a channel member to support future stories here on Nixxiom, to help us build an even bigger World of Warcraft lore nerd community right here on Nixxiom. And you also get rewards. And now, the more tragic detail that many people seem to have missed when it comes to this story. If your adventure back in Classic took you through Silverpine Forest, you might remember the quest chain Arugal's Folly. Started by talking with Dalaran Dawnweaver in the Sepulchre, we learn more about Arugal as a mage. First, through the examination of Arugal's notes that we collect for Dalaran Dawnweaver, we discover that Arugal, despite having been an archmage, wasn't actually that magically gifted. He was kind of pathetic. He relied on workarounds and tricks to compensate for his lack of magical ability. This is why I mentioned earlier in the video that perhaps his peers in the Kirin Tor, who likely knew of his lack of talent in magical craft, were displeased at his promotion to Archmage. But it's then, as we investigate further, that we learn something else. We discover that Arugal After having summoned the Worgen into Azeroth, what he did is he used enchanted shackles to subdue them, to make the Worgen serve him as their master. Dalar Dawnweaver says that such enchantments are a reinforcement for weak magic, which implies something rather disturbing. The Worgen who surrounded Arugal during his time of greatest grief, whom he now calls his sons, likely only serve him because of the shackles that he has placed upon them. Shackles that, in Dawnweaver's opinion, are very amateur. Perhaps, my friends, it was only a matter of time before they failed. And what then? Well, likely the very Worgen that Arugal had grown to find comfort in would have unleashed themselves upon the breaking of their bindings, tearing apart and eating the very man who takes comfort in them. Arugal was a young man with dreams when he arrived at Dalaran. He hoped to be a great mage one day, yet his lack of talent, study, choosing shortcuts, and laziness made him not the archmage he hoped to be, but a mockery of one. Arugal hoped that it would be his hand that saved what remained of the Kirin Tor, to perhaps be finally recognized for who he truly was, and yet his actions only furthered the destruction of Dalaran's people, those who had survived the destruction of the city. Now locked away in a haunted keep, Arugal is the Forsaken's enemy when it comes to their advancement south towards Gilneas, and for the Kirin Tor, Arugal is their shame. And all of this is why the Lord of Shadowfang Keep is one of my favorite villains in classic WoW. I would argue one of the best villains in all of World of Warcraft. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you want more Silverpine Forest lore to delight in, I made 2 videos that are on your screen right now. The first is my previous video talking about just how good and underrated Silverpine Forest is as a zone, thanks to all of its lore and world building that I cover. And the second video focuses in on one particular story from Silverpine Forest, a story that many players are unaware of. Thank you for watching, everybody. I think it's time for our journey to continue south. With my next lore video, we are going to Hillsbrad Foothills.